Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to part 1 of our tutorial series on Total War 3 Kingdoms featuring Cao Cao. In our last part, we went over the game settings as well as the campaign selection screen, and in this part, we'll be jumping into the campaign, but we will still not be playing any of it as there are tons of information to pass on in this early part of the game, and the main theme of today's part is the concept of Know Thyself. Now, since this game is constantly adapting, there will be future patches, and you might not be playing as the same faction I'm showing here. So the purpose of this tutorial is to familiarize yourself with all possible factions and all possible future patches, so I'll be generalizing a lot of the concept even though we will be playing as Cao Cao. So the main thing you have to know when playing this game is you need to know your faction, and namely your faction leader. Especially after the latest patch, which is 1.6.0, which is also the patch I'm recording this part on, each faction leader received certain buffs to reinforce their faction mechanic and playstyle. So the most important thing you can do when you're starting a game is to know your faction leader well, so you can plan out how you will approach your campaign. So whenever you jump into a campaign, you'll receive this notification which carries some narrative portion of why your character is doing what they're doing in the grand scheme of history. In this case, Cao Cao has been casted out and branded as an enemy to the Empire, and it's clear that only you have the capability to end Dongzhuo's tyranny and bring peace. You can use the surging populations and pliable peasantry of your homelands to your advantage, whilst vulnerable foes to the north may make expansion there beneficial. The time has come to increase your prestige and influence, then unite what has been divided. And there are usually a couple of notes on the bottom. Here we have be wary of Yuanshu to the west and Taoqian to the east, and claim the neighboring Han Empire regions. So these are hints given by the developers to help guide your early turns in the game. And if we close out this narrative message, we get our first in-game mission. And the first mission usually is the same for all factions, and it has to do with a battle. And the objective is always engage the falling general's army in battle. They'll give you the name of the general, and in case you're ever lost about a mission, let's say you're randomly at the edge of the map for some reason, just click on the magnifying glass and it will zoom in to where that army is located or where that landmark is located, depending on what the mission is, and you'll be able to identify what you have to do for the mission. And then there will be a reward. In this case, our reward is a 3-turn bonus. We get 30 points of military supply, which is a concept we'll cover soon once we get into army management. And also plus 5 morale, which is another concept we'll cover once we talk about units and their stats. Both of these are not today's lesson, and as we close this one, we're free to play the game. And if we continue to zoom out, you see the world map, and if you're familiar with China's geography, something might be amiss, and that's because the map isn't pointed north. The map is always slightly tilted due to the narrative camera works in the early progressions of loading a campaign, and you can always reset it by using this button on the right side called Point to North, and it will center your map for you. It looks something more like most world map we're used to. Now, of course, if you want to play facing south, you can do so. You can rotate your map any way you want with the Q and E buttons, and it's really up to you. I prefer to play pointing north. You don't have to, and sometimes because of terrains, let's say there's a mountain, I want to walk behind the mountain and I can't right click there, just rotate your map so you can, and if you're uncomfortable with playing this way, just rotate it right back afterward. So that is definitely a tool you can use. But that's not the point of today's lesson. The point of today's lesson is you must know your faction leader. And in this case, we are playing as Cao Cao. You might be playing as anyone else, and it's okay. And the best place to know a character is from the character menu on your right here. It is the second icon on this wheel of 5 icons. Now you might be thinking this is also an icon. This is a pin. This is a pin where it can highlight certain missions on the map. You can create your own pin to make notes on the map yourself. So I don't consider there's an actual icon because it didn't actually bring up any other menu. What you have is a missions icon, you have a characters icon, an armies icon, a commandery icon, and then a known faction icon. We'll just be talking about the characters icon today. We'll bring all these up as we progress in the campaign whenever they become a relevant topic in our part. In this part, we are just going to look at our faction leader. In this case, his name is Thyself. As you hover over his tab here, you can see right click to open the character detail. And if we do that, we pull up the character menu. And this is something that you'll be looking at quite a lot in the game. So the point of this part is to get you familiar with everything on this panel. So let's close this so it doesn't distract us as we'll take a look at Thyself here. So the first thing we might notice on this character panel is that you have your character's full portrait, pretty big on the left side, and that's where you can enjoy his art. But more importantly, to his left is a list of items that's part of your character's inventory. And for the purpose of this part, we're not really going to talk about what these items are, what stats are on them, how strong they are. That's not the purpose of this part here. The part here is just to get you familiarized with everything that's available on the character panel. So just know that for every character, there will be a weapon slot, an armor slot, a mount slot, a follower slot, and accessory slot, making up a maximum of 5 items per character. And then, right next to your character's lovely face, is this giant orb, and a number in the middle. This is your character's rank. And if you hover over this, the first thing you will see is a current XP, or experience bar. And it shows that you have currently 8,250 experience. And you need 16,000 experience to level up. So you're missing around 7,750. You can come here to check how close you are to your next level, and the amount will increase cumulatively, means you needed about 8,000 to rank up to rank 3, and you hit it over and you're at 8,250, and the maximum amount or the next threshold was upgraded to reflect the need for 16,000. So the numbers will just keep increasing, it's not going to reset at every level. And then you see a line that says he's a legendary character. Now, this character is of legendary repute, he's a legendary commander, and then it says, excels at inspiring friendly troops, but weaker in melee, best group with retinues of melee cavalry. So, a couple concepts to explain here. Legendary characters in the game is a very loosely used term. And in our case, you might think Thyself is our faction leader, he has his unique art, he's a very special character in the history and in the game, so therefore he's legendary. Well, that's not how actually the game defines legendary. All you need to do to become a legendary character in the game is to have one of your 5 stats over 100 points. In this case, our authority stat, which has filled up the first bar and has now overlapped with the second bar to about halfway, which is why you have 150 stat point, is officially over 100 points. Therefore, your character is deemed legendary. So even if you have the most generic and random character, if you're able to push one of their stats, and there are 5 of them here, to over 100 points, they will be deemed legendary. And then for our character, you can see that the orb is yellow. If we pull back this character panel real quick, you can see that there are other characters with different color orbs, and each color, much like the colors on the stats here, represents a different class. And in our case, our class is Commander. And the little line that says excels at inspiring friendly troop is a generic description of what commanders are meant to do. In this case, we can see that we are meant to inspire friendly troops, we are not as strong in melee, and we're best grouped with retinues of melee cavalry. And you might be confused with some terminology here, namely retinues. Retinues are units that are close to a given commander, and they will follow them to battle. And that is how the army system works in Three Kingdoms. Each general will have their own group of units called retinues, and armies are composed of various generals combined with their respective retinues. And in this case, it's recommending us to group him with retinues of melee cavalry. and there are certain reasons of doing so, and we'll cover this as our tutorial progresses. But for this part, let's continue. We see that it continues to give us a title here. It says Strategic Mastermind. And you can see the similar layout here on the right next to the orb. You see the legendary commander, you see our name, you see this term, Strategic Mastermind. Well, Strategic Mastermind is the character's background title. In this case, it describes what our character was historically. Now, there are many unique versions of these background titles in the game given to historically relevant characters, and there are also generic background titles in the game given to lesser important characters or characters that haven't received any love from the developers yet. But since the game is constantly upgrading and patching with new DLCs, we'll be seeing more unique backgrounds as the game progresses. But at this point, your faction leader clearly should have a unique background title. And in this case, the background title is Strategic Mastermind. But what is a Strategic Mastermind? Well, in the game, it provides you stats. You can see here he gets 40 points of Cunning, 15 points of Instinct, and 25 points of Authority because he is a Strategic Mastermind. He also gets 1 Resiliency. Now, resiliency is basically an extra life for your character. In battle, should you fall, if you have resiliency, which is represented by this heart with a cross, in this case a green cross, which means we have not been injured yet, then if we die, we don't actually die. We become injured, and we lose a level of resiliency. And the cross here will become a different color. If we only have 1 tier resiliency, then that means once we use up that one, the next time we die, we will die and the cross will become red. But if we have 2 tiers of resiliency, it'll become orange first, which means we have 1 more before we go to red, and then it'll become red, and then if we die again, we die officially. We won't come back from that. And resiliencies will recover and heal over time. It represents how wounded your character is from battle. And because we are an important character in the story, as part of our background title, we're given an extra layer of resiliency. All characters will gain 1 layer of resiliency once they become legendary, meaning their stats goes over 100, and they reach the rank of 4. So, once our character, who is already legendary, reach the rank of 4, we'll automatically get another layer of resiliency, pushing us to have about 3 lives. But right now we have 2. And then we have something called income from family estate, and it's getting increased by 50%, and there's a conditional statement after that. Everything in parentheses are conditions that you have to meet. In this case, it only applies if we are a faction leader. In this case, we are. And what are family estate? Well, every faction depends on their leader for some sort of income, and their leader depends on their family. If they come from a rich family, they get a bit more family estate, which is the case with Cao Cao, whose father was very wealthy. In this case, we get 50% extra, as every faction starts out with a default amount of 2,000 per turn. So every faction has a default income of 2,000 per turn from family estate. If your family background is rich, you get a bonus to it. In this case, 50% extra or 1,000 extra income per turn. If our family background is poor, we'll lose 25% or 50% depending on how poor our family was in history, and you have less income to work with. And that's always part of your faction leader. Now, let's say we're not playing as Cao Cao, and Cao Cao is an AI faction, and his faction get wiped. But Cao Cao is not dead, and he's wandering around, he gets confederated by another faction, and he joins that faction. Well, in that case, he's no longer that faction's leader, and this bonus will not activate, and would not affect that faction's family estate, as you need to be the leader of a faction to have this active. That's how these conditional statements work. Then we see something called minus 25% redeployment costs, and this has a different conditional statement after that. It says only if this character is Prime Minister, heir, or faction leader. In this case, we are a faction leader, so that works, but let's say we're not, we can be the heir to a faction or the Prime Minister of a faction, and this bonus will still be active. Now, I'm not going to explain what this bonus does until this becomes relevant in this campaign, but right now just know that it's a nice buff to have and will save us some money since it is a decrease to some sort of cost. And then we have minus 15% recruitment cost for cavalry. So we have cheaper recruitment of cavalry units, pretty straightforward, and you see two conditional statements. The first one's not really a condition, it just tells you what this applies to. In this case, this is applied faction-wide. You can see many different terms in these brackets, and you can see own army, this army, own retinue. So those are all things we'll run into as we proceed with this tutorial, but right now just know that faction-wide means the whole faction get to enjoy this bonus. And then there's the same condition of your character needs to be a prime minister, heir, or faction leader. And then lastly, we have +2 available spy positions, and the condition is the same. So these are all the bonuses we get. And then on the bottom, you see there's 2 checkmark in the speech bubbles, and it says commands perceptiveness and admires intelligence. Those are trait-based effects, and this is how your character views other characters in the game. And depending on how the other character view certain traits, you have different relationship structures that will form. We'll talk about this shortly. This will be a topic we'll cover in this episode here. And then you get a little flavor text talking about Cao Cao. So that covers this top portion of the menu. And then we have a general line saying what we are. We are a general. And it has a bunch of effects that's active that states if we're in this role. Now, this is not a very clear labeled effect, and there are some issues with this in patch 1.6, but basically the idea is we are a faction leader. So technically this should say faction leader, and it should list out all the effects we have for faction leader. It shouldn't list effects of administered for commandery. Commandery is basically a province. It's terminology equivalents for Western structures or for Total War games in the past is basically on the level of a province. But the issue here is China uses province for a different terminology. A bigger region in China is called a province, and it's divided into many commanderies, and within any commandery, they are smaller counties. So it's kind of the middle tier here. And we are not administering any commanderies. We're not administrator of a certain commandery, so those should not be listed here. But this is an issue on patch 1.6.0, so I'm just making that known. All the bonuses that says if character is prime minister, heir, or faction leader, or if the character is faction leader, those are the ones that should be listed here, as Cao Cao is our faction leader. Then this is just a symbol for general, and if you happen to be administrator, it will say administrator of X commandery here, and then those bonuses will be listed if you hover. Then we have an upkeep cost. This reflects both the cost of the general himself as well as any retinues he has if he is on the battle map. So in this case, Cao Cao is on the field, as we can see here. And here are his retinues to his right. As you can see, this army is composed of 2 generals with 2 retinues of 4 units each. But we'll talk about this when we talk about armies. Back to our character. Because we have these units, as you can see, 120 upkeep cost is right under the unit card, 340 upkeep costs, 270. That's why we are paying 730 per turn for having Cao Cao on the field right now. If he is not on the field, then this number would be 0, because we do not have a character salary simply because we are the faction leader. We are not going to pay ourselves. If we take a look at Xiahou here, we can see that he has an upkeep cost of 476, but he also has a salary cost of 150 because we are paying him. He is not part of the ruling family, so he is not free. If he was a family member, then they would demand 0 salary from the leader as well. But we'll be looking at these court characters a bit later. Right now, we will still remain focused on our leader here, because there is still a lot to cover. After upkeep, there's usually a flag here. Some characters do not have these, and that's totally fine, and some characters have these with a green face instead of a red face. Red face represent you have a grudge against a certain faction in the game. A green face represent you have a fondness toward a certain faction in the game. If you don't have this, just means your character currently do not have any grudges or fondness to any factions in the game, and that's all very normal. And what these things does is, if you have a grudge against a faction, you will have a huge satisfaction debuff should you work for that faction. If you have a fondness to that faction, you'll gain a satisfaction bonus, and you'll also gain more likelihood to join that faction should you be factionless. Now, how do you gain these grudges and fondness? Well, there's a lot of ways. Grudges are pretty easy to generate. If I have a character in the court, let's say Dun here, and I don't like him for some reason, and I want to kick him out of my faction, I can banish him. If I banish him, then he will gain a grudge against me. That's pretty easy to understand. If he is an enemy officer, for example, and we're fighting in a battle, and his army lost to mine, and I captured him, and I have a choice when I capture him. I can hire him, I can release him, or I can execute him. Well, in that case, if I release him or hire him, he will give us fondness because we spared his life. If we execute him, then his family member and friends will gain a grudge against us because we executed one of their friends or family. So those are all methods you can gain fondness and grudges. Now, we happen to have a grudge against Dongzhuo. It doesn't really explain to us why, but you can kind of guess sometimes if you hover to the next icon. In this case, we see past loyalties. This shows all the factions this character has worked for and the years they worked for them in. So we can see that from 174 to 189, we worked for the Han Empire. Then in 189, we worked for Dongzhuo. And narratively, that's because Dongzhuo took over the Han Empire. And you can see in the same year, we left him, or he banished us. In this case, by the narrative story at the beginning of this tutorial, in the beginning of the campaign, it tells us that we have exiled ourselves and been casted as a traitor. And that's why we have a grudge against our former faction leader Dongzhuo and his current faction. And then we started our own faction in 189, and the start of the game is always in the harvest season of 190 for the 190 Rise of the Warlord campaign. So that's where you can check a character's past loyalties, and you can kind of see how they acquire certain grudges. And grudges is a very useful indicator when recruiting other generals. Generals who have fondness towards you or grudges against their former master are less likely to be spies, because you know they either came to you voluntarily or were banished out from their former faction, therefore they were not sent by their former master to spy on you. So that's a useful trick to use grudges and fondness. Then we can see age. Now this will change depending on if you're playing on timeless mode or not. If you're playing on timeless mode, you will see how many turns he has been alive, and the number really becomes meaningless as he does not die from old age. But in our case, when you don't play on timeless mode, you can see his exact age. And once you reach the age of 60, the mortality rate starts ticking, and you have a chance to die of old age at the beginning of every turn. So that is something you can keep your eye out for. And then we already talked about resiliency. The check mark or the plus sign, depending on the color, tells you how injured you are. When we're green, we're fine, perfectly healthy. And then you have this icon that shows that we are part of a ruling family. Now, it doesn't have to be our ruling family. You can see other characters in game that's part of another faction's ruling family. And the key thing about being part of a ruling family is only members of the ruling family can be offered up in diplomacy for marriages. So if you have a character that you want to use to marry away in diplomacy, they have to be part of your family. You can achieve this by having them as your family member to begin with, or adoption. So that's how you got to deal with this. And you also have to watch out when you marry people that are part of your family. If your family married family X, then you can't have another family member marry that same family again unless the first couple divorced, because then it will be incest and it's not allowed. So that's something you have to keep your eye out for. Now, of course, divorce is pretty simple in the game, just a click of a button, and you do have to pay quite a bit of gold, just like in real life. Now, next, moving on, we have even more important things, and that is our stats. And the stats in the game, as well as many other elements in the game, are divided into what's called the traditional Chinese 5 elements, and they're called Jin, Mu, Shui, Huo, Tu, or metal, wood, water, fire, earth. If you're familiar with Avatar, you're pretty solid on most of these already. But anyhow, what the game does with these is they assign different uses for each of these elements, and each of them represents a separate stat your character can gain. And they are Expertise stat, Resolve stat, Cunning stat, Instinct stat, and Authority stat. And each stat can go from 0 to 200. And there are a lot of ways to gain these. We'll cover them as we move forth from the guide. But right now we can see Cao Cao at level 3 has 45 points of Expertise, has 42 points of Resolve, 96 points of Cunning, 45 points of Instinct, and finally 150 points of Authority. So you might think, wow, that's a ton of authority compared to everything else. And that's correct. And the reason why is because Authority is the primary stat of any commander class general. And it makes sense, because commanders are color-coded as yellow, Authority are also color-coded as yellow. So that's a pretty easy way for you to keep track of which stat is your primary stat. And then let's talk about what each stat does. So Expertise does two things. As you gain more Expertise, you'll gain an increased discount to construction cost, only if you are the administrator of a commandery. You can see that conditional statement right there. And you gain 8 points of melee evasion, and this is on self. So your character will gain increased melee evasion. Now some of these terminologies I know will not make a lot of sense right now because we haven't really covered about unit stats and the stat card. But let's just remember Expertise gives us melee evasion, which is dodge chance in the game, and also reduce cost for construction. Then we have Resolve, which increases your general's health pool by a certain percentage, as well as increased population growth if you are the administrator of a commandery. So in this case, very similar to Expertise, you have a stat that's being boosted for your own general, and then also a stat being boosted if you are administrator. Moving on, we have Cunning. Now things are becoming a little different. You gain 38% extra ammo boost to your own retinue. And we talked about retinues are the group of units that are bound to your general. In this case, we have these 4 here. We have 1 archer unit, and that archer unit is going to get an increase to its ammo. And if we click on it, you can see on the stat card that little bit of green boost on ammo, and that represents the amount we're getting boosted by Cao Cao's Cunning stat. And as you can see, you have a blue stat in Cunning boosting a blue unit in Archer Militia. And color coding is going to be something you're going to see happen all over the place in this game, and makes it very helpful to learn, because some of these concepts are pretty conceptual once you get used to the color schemes. But aside from the boost to ammo on your own retinue, it also boosts your military supply on your own army by 9 points. Now we didn't really talk about this very much when we looked at the missions, but military supplies are basically supplies carried by each army. When you have these, you get increased to morale, increased to replenishment. When you don't have these, your army starts suffering from attrition and man will start dying. So that's pretty much what military supply is used for, and it's being boosted to the whole army. So it's contributing to the whole army's military supply. Well, the Cunning boost only applies to our retinue, so if our second general had some archers, they would not receive that ammo boost. Then we have Instinct, which will boost our own damage by 5%. That's melee damage here. So technically, this damage is only going to boost our quote-unquote melee damage base, and not our armor piercing damage, which is a different damage. That is a deeper discussion for when we will look at the unit cards and also the stats. But right now, just know it helps increase our damage. And then it also helps reduce our recruitment cost for this army. Now this terminology is terrible because we just used a different terminology called own army, but in reality, this army and own army are the same thing. It's boosting the army that the general is in, and it makes recruitment costs cheaper for everyone in the army. So if I'm recruiting a new unit in the army, because I have 45 points of instinct, I'm going to save 1%. Then finally, we have authority. Authority will give 10 points of satisfaction. That is how satisfied your other generals are with you. In our case, we don't have a satisfaction stat because we are the faction leader. So satisfaction is a reflection of how satisfied they are with you, so you don't have this. But if we jump to 夏侯惇, you can see next to their age is this satisfaction icon, and it shows all the positive and negative factor as well as the net value. Now, any value above 25 will be in the yellow or orange tier here. It's a neutral tier. Below 25 is in red, and that's when they're dissatisfied. And I believe above 60 is green, and that's when they're very satisfied with you. And there's different effects too when they're in different level of satisfaction, and we'll talk about that when that becomes relevant. For now, just know that high authority gives you higher satisfaction if the character with the high authority is a prime minister, heir, or faction leader. So in this case, since we are the faction leader, everyone faction-wide is getting this boost of 10 points, which we can see on Xiaohodun if we hover here. You can see there is a category called 10 points from authority from people in power. It's the second line after the positive factors, and that reflects on Cao Cao's current level of authority. This is very, very useful if you play on any difficulty level, really, because this is the main way you can gain free satisfaction in the game, by having a high authority leadership role. And the leadership roles are your prime minister, your heir, and your faction leader. In the early game, only the faction leader and heir are unlocked, so those two roles are very crucial in the early game. Aside from this faction-wide boost, you also have another own retinue boost, and that's unit morale. And morale is something we'll talk about once we jump into battle. Just know for now that authority stat also will help boost your own retinue's unit morale. Moving on from stats, we have something called traits. And traits here, every character starts out with 3. There are literally hundreds of traits, and there is a guide on the channel called the Ultimate Trait Guide, and I have compiled all the traits in the game and what they does and analyze them and how to trigger new traits. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. But a couple concepts you should know is you always start out with 3. It's predetermined by the game. It's a reflection of who the character was historically, and you have 5 more slots to gain new traits. Every new trait will be gained in this first slot, and this third trait will be pushed down over here, being displayed down here with just a little icon. You can still hover over it to check the detail, but right now there's 3 traits, and if we hover over them, not go into details about what they does, you can see they affect stats, mostly positively. There are traits that will decrease your stats, and Cao Cao luckily don't have any, but they are those traits, just so you know. And there's other effects, whether they're faction-wide, whether they're for commanderies, whether they're for leadership roles. It varies, and if you want to know the detail of each one, definitely go check out that guide that I talked about. I'll link it in the description below. And the main thing you have to do for your faction leader, for your game, is just to take a look at each character's trait. It's very important. That way you know what this character is good at. And the trait bonuses combined with the background bonuses really determines how you should use your character. And you should keep an eye out for traits. Now, how do you control new traits being gained? Honestly, you can't. There are certain triggers that will increase the probability of certain traits being gained, but there is no guarantee. Now, in all likelihood, the game prefers to give you traits from the stats you have really high stats on. But in this case, because we have high authority and high cunning, blue and yellow traits are the traits we're most likely to gain. And the color of the traits is based on what's their primary stat gain. In this case, 6 points of cunning, 2 points of instinct, it's a blue trait. Ambitious trait, 8 points authority, well, that's a entirely authority trait, so it's a yellow trait. Dutiful, also 8-point authority, and so forth. And if we go to a champion character, which is a different class of character, they're green, you can see they have a mixture of traits here, but green traits primarily increase resolve stat, and you can see we even lose 4 points of cunning here, so there are positives and negatives on these traits. So, we talked about traits. There's one more thing you need to know about trait. Below all the stats that are relevant to gameplay, you have speech bubbles with green check marks and red crosses in them. And like the personality you saw from the background titles, these also dictate how your character view other characters. So in this case, because we're suspicious, we don't like other ambitious characters, even though we are ambitious ourselves, which actually makes us hate other ambitious characters more. So this way, If we are in the same army, you can see the same speech bubble here. It says harmony and disharmony. If we are in the same army or in the same court, in the same commandery, walking by each other, and they're both ambitious, they will both hate each other. And when they hate each other, you will lose satisfaction, and you will gain different levels of relationship. If you're friendly, you become friends and eventually oaththorns. If you're disharmonized, then you can become rivals or nemesis. So that's kind of how this works in the game. So definitely keep an eye out on that. It's very hard to keep track. I know there's so many of them, and they're kind of just a throwaway line inside the trait, and it's kind of hard for you to strategize how to group people. So the best way to do it is just to look at the speech bubbles next to the character to see if they get along with the people next to them. In this case, people in the same army are obviously next to each other, and you can see that our leader and his general do in fact get along, which is great. So that's the traits. Then we move on to the skill tree. Now there are actually 3 different panels of information here, so there's still a bunch to cover in this guide, bear with us. First is the skill tree. Now, all Hun generals, and if you don't know what are Hun generals, almost all base game factions are Hun, except for the bandits. And if you have purchased the Yellow Turban DLCs or the 180 Mandate of Heaven DLC where you can play as Yellow Turbans are also not Hun. They are ethnically Hun, but they are treated as a different subculture in the game, and they will have a different looking skill tree. Bandits will have a different looking skill tree. And finally, the Southern Tribes will also have a different looking skill tree. Now those are all DLC related except for the bandits. The bandits are part of the main game. And even for the bandits, the structures as the lines still look the same, as you still have a grid of 3x5s with vertical lines going down between each column here, and there's no cross line in the middle. But for Yellow Turban, it becomes very different. But in this case, this is our skill tree for Cao Cao. Now, each unique character, once with art, will have a unique skill tree. Now, it might not be crazy unique, as they might only have 1 or 2 skills that's different from a generic character that's a commander, but they will have unique skill trees. If you have a generic character, and what do I mean by generic character? Well, you see that Cao Cao looks like this. Lady Bian, also a commander, looks like this. They don't look generic. Then you have Cao Cao's father, who looks like this. This is a generic character. You have Cao Ren, who looks like this. This is a generic character with a fancy armor, so fancy looking hat, but a generic character. These are characters who have not received art yet, or will never receive art, but in this case, Cao Ren will probably definitely receive art in a future DLC or a future update, so expect that coming. But in Cao Song's case, we're probably never going to see artwork made for him, and he is what deemed a generic character. And in this case, generic character all have the same skill tree of the same class. That is, all generic commanders will have the same exact skill tree. Now, if you take a quick peek at this and then take a quick peek at this, it looks very similar, right? Almost all the icons look the same. Matter of fact, if you just look at the icons themselves, they are the same. But Cao Cao's skill in the middle here is unique to him. Even though the art is the same earth symbol, his version is different from his father's version, which is a generic version. So that's why it says each skill tree for unique characters will be slightly different. And for all characters, when you are level 1, and we'll use a level 1 character to highlight this, you always start with a random active ability and a connecting passive ability. So on this tree of 15 different skills, the 3 here in the middle, 1, 3, 5 position, are active abilities. They are represented by the symbol of your class, in this case authority, earth symbol for commanders, and if we go to champion, you have the wood symbol. Those are active abilities, or sometimes they're passive abilities, but they're basically abilities you can use in combat. That's why I'm calling them active abilities. They're skills that you can use on the battle map. Aside from them, you have 12 other skills that are used as part of a stat boost or some effect that you can benefit sometime in battle. Sure, there are battle bonuses, but they're not active or passive abilities on your character in battle. So you get one of these, let's just call them active abilities right now, and you automatically get one that's attached to them. So when you have one of them, it's either the one on top or one on bottom. It will be random. It's predetermined for important characters, but if you have a randomly generated character level 1, they'll randomly get one of the active abilities and then one ability next to them. That is also a neat trick to know if you're looking for a certain character with a certain ability, because you can check their active abilities and see which skill they most likely would have. But that's a topic for another day. In this case, what we need to know is that each time we rank up, we can pick a new ability that's linked to our current abilities. So if we rank up, we can pick up this one, or this one. We cannot go to the rest of them. And we have to follow the lines as we unlock them. You cannot unlock all of them. With each rank up, you can get one more. Max rank is 10. So from rank 1, when you start out with 2, you can rank up a total of 9 times to reach the rank of 10. So technically you think you have 2, you get 9 more, that's the 11. Well, luckily the game has updated so that when you reach rank 10, you get an extra skill point for maxing out your character. So you get actually 12 different skills that's unlockable. So in the end here, out of 15 skills, you can unlock 12 of them. There are 3 that you have to give up on. So keep that in mind when you're planning out how to activate different skills. If you're curious, there are character guides on the channel for generic characters and how to upgrade their skill tree for different builds. It's all there, and go check them out. So that's the skill tree portion. Moving on, we have the military tab, and this shows our unit stats. And this is probably the best time for me to go over them. I'll go over them again when we jump into our very first battle, but right now what we need to know is we have a stat called morale. This is what determines if you're willing to fight or not. If morale goes to 0, your unit will rout. Now they have a chance to regain some morale as they're routing, and if they go back above 0 again, they can rally back and come back to join the fight. Or else they become an uncontrollable mess that will try to flee the battlefield, and once they reach the edge of the map, they're gone. If a unit routs multiple times or take farther morale loss after routing, then they become what's shattered. Once they're shattered, even if you have half of the unit alive, they are unwilling to fight anymore, and they will just leave the battlefield or get chased down and killed. So, morale is super important. It's more important than your health. So morale is key here. Then the next stat is hit points. Oh, before we continue, yours might look like this when you open the game up. This is a basic stat look. I prefer to hit the plus mark here to look at the detail stat. This breaks it down more. This is a generic look at your unit. So we have health points or hit points. This number will be different depending on what unit size you picked before you started the campaign. On large, yours should say 19k as well, if it wasn't patched in future patches, or something close to it. If you're playing on extreme, this will double, just like how retinue sizes will double. And then you have a melee charge bonus. This is a very complicated stat to explain. But what this does is if you are charging into an enemy, this bonus will be applied as a bonus factor. So it's not added onto your damage, it's kind of multiplied on as a certain factor that increases it. So the higher charge bonus you see, the more increased stat you will get when you charge into an enemy. This bonus will last for about 10 seconds as it slowly fades after the charge. This is most important for cavalries because you carry an initial momentum with your charge bonus, and that momentum can kill enemies. And that is what gives you most of your damage up front as a cavalry unit. So we'll talk about these in much more detail once we get into a battle tutorial. Then you have melee attack rate. This is how many times you can attack over a minute. It doesn't mean you will always attack this over a minute, because your unit model still needs to be next to an enemy unit model for them to swing. So this is basically the maximum amount of time you can attack. If you're locked into a duel though, This will dictate how fast you can melee attack. Then you have two different attack damage here, a melee damage base and a melee damage armor piercing. Now, like the name suggests, armor piercing portion of the damage will go through any armor the enemy have, which is a separate stat you'll see very soon, and those damage will just all go through on hit. This damage will be reduced by the percentage of armor. So if you see 50% armor, let's use an easy number, and let's say this number is exactly 1000, not 1.1k, then only 500 damage will go through. And that 500 damage will be added onto your armor piercing damage for a total of 1.5k damage, and that's how much you will hit per hit. So that's kind of how damage works in the game. Now, that's assume you get a hit, because you have a stat called melee evasion. And you also have base, and then you have a shield value here, which we don't have, but melee evasion shield is a thing if you are holding a shield. Generals do not hold shield, so they don't have melee evasion shield. But certain units do, as you can see, these have shield on them. And what happens when you have a melee evasion shield is if you're fighting a melee battle from the front, where the shield is placed, this number will be added onto your base value for a total amount of melee evasion. And this dictates your dodge chance. Now, the number you see, so 8% here, is not exactly your dodge chance. The game made it so that when you're at 100% melee evasion, there is still a minimum base hit rate. So it's not like once you get your stat to a point where you have 100% melee evasion, you become unhittable. There's still about a 4% chance you will get hit. So there's a default hit rate at play here. So this number here is not a complete reflection of the melee evasion in the game, but it's a good rough estimate. It's a very powerful stat in the game because no matter how strong you are, if you can dodge the damage, it's pointless. Moving on, we have armor. Let's say you can't dodge the damage and you're getting hit by melee damage, by range damage, by explosion damage. Doesn't matter what damage you're getting hit by, armor will prevent a portion of that, except for armor piercing damage. And there's armor piercing range damage, there's armor piercing melee damage, and armor piercing explosion damage. So those damage always go cleanly through if you get the hit. The armor just helps reduce the percent of base damage. You can also have an armor shield, but this once again is only from the front. So if you're battling a unit from the front and then you get flanked from the side or the rear, those units getting hit will not receive this bonus from the shield. So that's something you have to consider when orienting your army and protecting them from flanking. Then we have another stat that's very important in the game, and it's called range block chance. And this is your dodge rate for arrows. So if you're getting shot by enemy projectiles, arrows only, so non-artillery. If the enemy is throwing a trebuchet shot at you, a giant rock, your range block chance isn't going to be a factor there. But if you're getting shot by arrows from archers or crossbowmen, this will come into play as you have a 30% chance of dodging those hits. So this is a good reflection of the amount of range damage you can avoid. And finally, we have the speed stat, which is often overlooked, but speed is actually super important in the game. And we'll talk about all these again once we jump into a battle, and pretty much for every battle, because it will play in part of how you want to use your unit and the strategies you will apply. But generally, this is what all of them do in the game. And the speed here will change and the charge will change. As you can see, there's a little shaded red portion, as we have seen like a shaded green portion for a bonus. And the reason why they will change is if we become dismounted in battle, the charge bonus will decrease because portion of the charge is from our horse, as well as speed. Speed is dictated by our horse here because we are riding a mount. You can see a base speed of 105 on the horse, and that's kind of applied to this. This is higher than 105 because of different factors. We have other bonuses at play here, but we're not really going to talk about those. And then you see two other things. You see current retinue and special units. Current retinue are always what you have right now. You can have up to 6 units in a given retinue, and it will always be displayed here or on the unit card here if the unit's ready on the field. This is probably the easiest place to see it. But let's say we're not on the field. Let's say we pick someone who's at court. You can see this group here is on the field, this group here is on the court. Let's say we pick Xiao Houyuan. You see that even though he's not on the field, we can't see him, you can see that he has some retinues with him. So in our case, we have these 4 units, which are reflected down here as well. Now, what are special units? Special units are units only you or your class or your faction can recruit. There are some restrictions applied, and that's why they're called special units. They're not that special. So Spear Guards are special because they can only be recruited by 2 classes, champions and commanders. That's why they're here. Then you have Jian Sword Guard Cavalry, which can only be recruited by commanders, which is why they're here. Then you have your Tiger and Leopard and your Heavy Tiger and Leopard. These are your faction unique unit. They can only be recruited by anyone in Cao Cao's faction, so that's why they're special. They're not really special for your faction, but it's special for the whole game world. That's why these are special units. They're not really special, they're just restrictive units. So if you move on to, let's say, a champion, you have a different list. Faction unique unit, once again, are here. Spear Guard, we said, is shared between the 2, but only the Heavy Spear Guard is available to champions, so that's why he's here. Now you see a little lock here, means we can't recruit this yet because we haven't had all the requirement, and one of those requirements is rank 6. So that's kind of a place where you can see what special units you can recruit. It's not the specialness of the unit themselves, but just the restriction on who can recruit those units. So that's the military tab. And finally, we do have one thing, sorry, abilities. So this is something we talked about in the skill. We have certain active abilities or battlefield abilities, and you can see them here. Unyielding Earth, this is this skill right here. And because we have this unlocked, we have this to use in battle. We also have other things, Immune to Terror. This is from bonus from our armor or weapon. I'll talk about this when we talk about items. But basically, these are bonuses we have on our character. They're either from skill bonuses, trait bonuses, background bonuses, or item bonuses. So they could be from a lot of places. These highlighted ones are always the active abilities you get. And then over here, these last 2 in silver are relationship bonuses, which is something we're about to talk about, which is why we jump back real quick. So here you see that we have a friend in our army. Only when this friend is in the army will you see this, because this is a battle-related panel. So this is all the bonus you'll see once you jump into a fight. In this case, we have Xiaodu in our army. He is our friend. Therefore, we get this bonus. And you can see the friend bonus is a defensive one that lasts forever. Both of us, since we're both friends with each other, will get +5 morale. And also get +5% range block chance. So a small bonus added on to us once we go into battle. And it's enabled if all friends alive and has friends. That second line is very hurtful, but in this case, that's true. If our friend should die, we'll get a different bonus called Fallen Friend, and that will come with a small heal and also an increase to our damage. And then we have, it's right here. There we go, I just covered this. If our friend are dead, all friends dead, has friend. Then we'll get a 9k heal, which is a small heal, considering that we had 19k health. It's a half heal, it's not bad. And you also get a damage boost. And you're also berserk for the first 10 seconds. So you can see phases. Phase 1, first second of that happening. The second right after your friend died, you gain 9k health. Then for the next 10 seconds, we enter phase 2, the grievings phase. And during that time, we become berserk. Berserk means we're out of control. You can no longer control this character. He will just hit whatever is closest to him. You'll gain a bonus of damage, both to base and armor piercing, and 5% melee evasion. And you'll also enter phase 3 after the 10 seconds. You'll calm down, accept the loss, and you'll just have the damage buff and the melee evasion buff without the berserk. Now, it says dead here, but if you have resiliency, in our case, which we do, and in his case, he also does, you can see it down here, he just has to die in the battle. Technically, he's only wounded, but he's seen as dead in that battle, and you'll still get this bonus. So that's something you can keep an eye out for. There's 2 tiers of friendly bonus from the check marks, and that is Friend and Oaththorn, which we talked about. And there's also additional bonus called Family. That's if you're related to that person. And then for a cross or the red mark bonus for people who don't like each other, you can get Rivalry and Nemesis. And those are straight up offensive bonuses. You get attack. Both of them are eager to prove themselves, so they both do extra attack. In this case, we do defensive bonus until our friend dies, and then we get a heal and then extra damage. For Nemesis and Rivalry, it starts out being an offensive bonus, and if your rival dies, you're happy and it's done. You get no more bonuses, it's gone. Now, you don't get any heals. It doesn't work that way, but it makes sense. Then we go to the relationship tab. And for Cao Cao, this is actually quite busy because he knows quite a few characters already in history at this point. If you're playing one of the minor factions, you might get a character that has almost no one in it. Maybe you're playing as, you're not never going to play as Cao Ren, but in this case, Cao Ren only knows the faction leader. And you can see how you know each other. In this case, they're friends with each other, and they are influenced by the fact they're family. And you can see why they like each other. You can be family and hate each other, but in this case, he like each other because they both have the dutiful trait, and in that case, dutiful like other people who focus on duty, therefore they have a high opinion of each other, therefore they're easier to have a time to develop into a friendship. In the case with Xiahou Dun, Cao Cao and Xiahou Dun both also have dutiful, they are friends because they have good opinions of each other, they have fought battles together, and they have won. It's key that you fought together and won. You can gain negative relationship by losing battles together, right? So that's kind of how it works. We're in the same faction, and then there's other opinions as well. And he is family with Xiahou Yuan. And Cao Cao has multiple ones. Some of them are not in our faction, as you can see, like Dong Zhuo. We are nemesis with Dong Zhuo because of past events, because of diplomacy. And if there's war, it's going to say war. And in this case, we are rivals with Chen Gong. And we can also be acquaintances with people who we had battles. In this case, we had a battle with him, so he's on the negative side, but we still could respect each other and potentially gain relationship based on what we have. So from our strategic mastermind background, we like perceptiveness, and he has the perceptive trait, so we like him, even though right now we are on the side of negative relationship. So the green and red just tells us our current relationship. The arrows and crosses tell us how things will trend. And then on the gold here, that is where spouses go. So you can see us with Lady Bian as our spouse. She is our wife. And if we go to her, you can see that we are her husband. You can do this for other characters. If they don't have one, means they're single right now in the game. So that's pretty much the relationship panel, and that explains everything in this character panel. I know it's quite a drag to go through all these details, but I feel like if we want a comprehensive guide, we must go through it, and this is probably the best way to do so. And this is the best thing you can do for your faction at the beginning of a game. If you're new to the game, if you're new to the faction, know what your leader does. The most important part of this to look at is actually the title. The background title contains most of the faction relevant bonuses. In this case, redeployment costs, which means we're good at redeploying units. We can fight on the west and then redeploy our troop very cheaply on the east and be able to fight multi-front battles and fight far away through our kingdom. We have 15% recruitment cost discount for cavalry. Means we're very good at recruiting cavalry. Maybe we have good cavalry units. In this case, we have faction unique cavalry units, and we're better at recruiting those. And then we also have 2 available spy positions. So maybe we are good at espionage and we can utilize that to our advantage. So definitely check these out when you're looking at your characters. So that wraps up this part of the tutorial. We'll come back on the next part and we'll look at our court and how to manage it before we jump into the first turn here, because there are many things to cover at the beginning here. We have to talk about courts, we have to talk about items, we have to talk about diplomacy, and then we have to talk about battle. So bear with us as we'll have a very slow start, but hopefully you find this information very helpful on your campaign, and we'll see you next time. Bye!